in this video, we're going to look at the part of the PowerPoint that talks about feudalism. Feudalism develops out of the people's need for protection against invaders and landowners' need to defend their property. So it's going to be a mutually beneficial relationship for all parties involved. More beneficial for some rather than others. But the feudal system grew out of the practice of clientage or patronage, which had existed under the Roman Empire. These practices involved smaller landowners placing themselves under the protection of larger landowners, usually in exchange for payment or for goods. And in medieval feudalism, individual monarchs throughout Europe are unable to afford protection of their empires. So they're going to give their trusted soldiers parcels of land in exchange for their promise to defend it and make it useful. Feudalism appeared in Europe during the 700s in areas that we now know as France and Germany, as weak governments are going to seek solutions to the question of how to provide security with limited resources. By the thousands, most of Western Europe practiced some form of feudalism. So it is born out of a need for protection for their land and also people to work their land. So it becomes a relationship that's beneficial on all sides. There are some clearly defined roles in the feudal system. Let's talk about those. At the very top, technically on the very, very top of the pyramid, you'd have the Pope, and then under that. But let's talk about the roles, and then we'll talk about the structure of it. The Lord is the landowner, usually a noble, although sometimes lords were bishops. A vassal is a person, usually a soldier, who is given a piece of land by the Lord. A fief, is the land itself that is given. A manor, sometimes referred to in the context of the manorial system, is a basic unit of land, usually big enough for the supervision of a single noble or knight. And the serf, and though technically it translates as the word slave, the word serf, often used interchangeably with the word peasant, refers to a worker of the Lord's manor. So serfs weren't technically slaves, but they have no legal rights and were compelled to work on their assigned land, a lot of times never leaving that property. And so they really took the status of kind of slaves under this feudal system. So let's look at the power structure. Again, what I referred to earlier, technically the Pope would sit up here, and under him you'd have the monarch, then the nobles, and then the lesser nobles, the knights, the vassals, and then at the very bottom, the peasants. And this is also indicative of the amount of people that were part of that particular group. So few monarchs, a little bit more nobles, a little bit more lesser nobles and knights, and the largest group in this structure was the peasants. In most of European feudal relationships, the power structure evolves remained intact for several centuries. So at the top of the pyramid, we have the monarch, we know the king, who granted autonomous control over different parts of the kingdom to the nobles. So in exchange for good deeds, things that they have done, status, they were given land. And these nobles become vassals of the monarch in exchange for land. So each vassal swears an oath of fealty or loyalty to the monarch. And although the nobles were very powerful, they often subdivided their land to these lesser nobles and to these knights, who then become vassals to the noble in much the same capacity as the nobles serve the monarch. So the lesser knights serve the nobles serve the monarch. And the vast majority of the people in the feudal system were the peasants. And these are your very, very poor individuals who are responsible for tending the land. All of these relationships were based on exchange, and the monarch granted land in exchange for management. The nobles granted land and protection in exchange for goods, and the lesser nobles grant protection in exchange for goods. And all levels of societies were bound by a loyalty to the level above them. So it keeps them in that status, and it's very, very hard for them to navigate and to move up on this social structure. Anytime that I think of the feudal system, what comes to mind to me is the modern day movies of the Cinderella. There's one particularly, Ever After, and even the modern Cinderella movie that came out a couple years ago. You see the vassals, the peasants, working that manor and that system for those nobles. Let's talk about some of these nobles. The knights. The knights tended to be the vassals of nobles, and in exchange for land, they swear an oath of fealty. Remember, that means loyalty to the noble, and they agree to fight for and protect them. Horses, heavy armor, and weapons are very expensive, which meant that elite warriors usually come from noble classes or were financed by them. And there were two types of soldiers in feudal Europe: the common foot soldiers, usually peasants that were forced into service, and knights. And these knights are going to be your elite warriors. The knights' training was very rigorous, took a great deal of time. Boys were often chosen to be knights early in life so that training could begin. Kind of sounds like that Spartan Empire, doesn't it? Milestones in a knight's life were as follows. By age 7, they served as a page, an attendant, in the personal service of an individual knight. They were given basic lessons in horsemanship and basic hand-to-hand fighting skills. By age 14, successful students would be granted the title of squire, which included sword privileges and increasing difficult physical challenges and tasks, such as assisting a knight in battle. And by age 21, they were formally qualified to become a knight. Knighthood could be achieved in one of two ways. Usually a squire would be knighted as a rite of passage at the end of his training. However, he would also be granted knighthood after a particular act of bravery. Knights were supposed to live by a code of behavior known as chivalry, which required them to remain loyal to their lords, fight with honor, treat everyone with justice, and act politely towards women. Although chivalry has been celebrated and idealized in literature and in popular imagination, many historians know that it wasn't universally practiced, and its rules were often ignored. A lot of times we romanticize things through movies, and we tend to believe that that's the way things really are, but that code of chivalry wasn't always practiced. The medieval tournament, a means of practicing military skills. So knights needed to practice their military skills, and they did so in exercises known as tournaments, mock battles that involved both real weapons and actual combat. Although some tournaments outlawed points on swords, so that no one would kill anyone, tournaments ranged from small affairs with a handful of knights to grand stage affairs played out in front of large audiences, so form of entertainment, much like we have medieval times today that we can go to and watch a jousting tournament. The rules varied throughout the ages, but as tournaments become more violent and various monarchs of Europe seek to limit or in some cases ban the practice of these medieval tournaments. Another popular sport in late medieval Europe was jousting, which involved two knights charging at each other on horseback and attempting to dismount each other. Picture of a castle here, Warwick Castle in England. Castles were often the center of life for nobles and knights, serving as homes and fortresses. Building a castle is often like a lifelong pursuit of these nobles. Some castles would even take several generations to complete. Castles were usually constructed by serfs and masons. Masons are craftsmen who work with stone. And once they were built, these buildings would serve a number of purposes. Intimidation, one of them. They were built in the spirit of competition with other nobles, like my house is bigger than yours. Friendly or otherwise. A large castle would serve as a sign of the nobleman's strength, esteem, and power. And castles were often situated at a high point in a region so that they could be seen from great distances. Also, military and tactically, that was a good decision, so that if anyone was trying to attack the castle, you could see them coming from a long distance away. A military defense, what I just alluded to, castles were built with military use in mind. They have clever defensive designs incorporating elements such as moats, which is the water around it, large watchtowers, high walls. Castles were sometimes built in the outer regions of a noble's land as a means of kind of encroaching upon another noble's territory. In modern day, we call those frontal capitals. We put our capital in a strategic region, hoping to reclaim the land close to it at some point. And a residence. Nobles and their families live in the castles, and so the castles of the higher nobles were often lavishly decorated, with rich tapestries on the walls, grand halls, and music rooms. And a lot of times, those who were able to obtain items from the East, from China, from India, were able to display these in their castles. So these castles were dark, lit only by torches and fireplaces, and the rooms were large and drafty because the windows don't yet have glass on them. All right, let's look at these discussion questions. Again, I suggest you write them down. If you have any questions about how to answer these, bring them to class with you. We'll discuss these, and you can get clarification on something that you might not understand. Number 1, what trends or events in early Middle Ages help explain why feudalism became an effective way to provide protection and security to people in various parts of Europe? Number 2, from the point of view of a monarch in Middle Ages, what advantages can you see to accepting a system of feudal relationships as opposed to trying to rule directly over an entire population? What would the disadvantages be? Number 3, knights were expected to live according to a code of chivalry, yet many historians say this code was often ignored in practice. Why then do you think a code of chivalry was seen as such a key part to the whole concept of knighthood? Pretty easy one to answer there. Answer those questions. Have any concerns, let me know.